Hello, thank you for taking the time to look at this segment of a 9-part series that I'm putting out there just to try to generate some discussion on what it is that we would like for our politicians to accomplish in Washington, other than simply investigate each other, depending on who is in office. So I put down some thoughts on 9 areas that I would like for the parties to address in their platforms going forward as we head into the 2024 election, which now we're in a 2-year election cycle all the time. I hope that some of this stuff is accomplished before then, but at the very least, I hope that each party considers these topics and others. Look forward to getting your feedback on this and other ideas that you might have so that we can continue this discussion here and with whomever else you might come into contact. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate your feedback. One of the things that I think I have changed my opinion on is an unfettered support of the military and particularly the conservative argument for how we develop, generate, maintain a strong military and the role of that military, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of nation building, the idea of American power everywhere to enforce what exactly, I am no longer sure we are clear on anymore. And the degree to which what we say we want to enforce vis-a-vis the military, if the military is even capable of doing that or should be used to do that, and the degree to which we as a nation have an annual military budget larger than I believe it is the next 10 nations combined. Why is that the kind of world that we want to model? And so, one of the things that I'm proposing that I think is even more radical than some of the other proposals I've suggested as I try to think through this and ask for your feedback is that our military spending should be tied to and subordinate to our spending on other aspects of our uh, our governmental investments. And the framework that I would like to propose is that the degree to which this is 2023 and not 1723 or 1823 or even 1923, we need to recognize that we need to approach the world differently, both in the context of the international framework and the national framework and the local framework. That while many things are the same across time, there are many things which are fundamentally different today in many respects than they were even 50 years ago. And so when it comes to the military, I think we need to, instead of setting up a competition between what we spend on I'm drawing a blank on the terminology that I want to use, but instead of um, trying to have the struggle between are we going to spend more, are we spending the same as on uh, national things as opposed to international things, and that's not the right way to frame it. Are we going to spend more on programs that benefit Americans or on programs that have to do more with the international scene, primarily through the military? I would suggest that we ought to peg our primary expenditures against the national and our secondary expenditures towards the military. So we kept military spending to 50% of social spending with emphasis on defensive strategies and security overseas in the context of pursuing peace by focusing on mutual interest with other nations. Now, elsewhere, I talk about, and I will talk about again, the Ukraine war. And when I think about that and the context in which that developed, but the degree to which we are spending money on the military that could be spent on something else, so that not only $400 billion in interest in the 2023 budget is being spent, but instead of nearly $900 billion on the military, what if we only spent $450 billion on the military? And that doesn't even count the over $100 billion that we spent in support of the Ukraine war and what that has done to our military preparedness, and will thereby set up justification for, rightly or wrongly, future military expenditures. And so, in conjunction with this, no use of U.S. military equipment, troops, or funds in any theater without proper congressional approval. I just heard in the last day or two that the U.S. has been in perpetual conflict somewhere in the world since 1989. And yet I don't believe there's been any declaration of war in that time. So we need to get a handle on how, in fact, we are utilizing our military, how our military is being utilized to effect political agendas as opposed to national agendas with respect to what we as a nation stand for and how we want to be represented in the world. For any action approved by Congress that goes on for more than 5 years, there must be a special biannual vote of approval or termination by direct vote of the U.S. populace, so that not only can the president no longer entangle us in a 20-year war, but neither can Congress entangle us in a 20-year war, apart from biennial, or biennial, I should have said, biennial votes to secure agreement that we as a nation stand behind this conflict. So there's a lot to unpack here in the context of the military, but I think it's time that we face up to the fact that we are being asked and consistently have been asked to spend a lot of money. And now, as the proposed neoliberal order is coming to perhaps an end, and America's place on the world stage is being challenged, we might wonder if, in fact, America has made the best use possible of her time at the head of the world stage, and whether or not we can salvage our opportunity to do better going forward. So, with respect to the military, another major issue that was brought to my attention actually by President Trump. I spoke about President Trump and his reelection bid in another video. And one of the things that I noted in that video was that while at first I was concerned with what he had to say about NATO and several other actions that he took on the international stage, one thing that I've changed my mind about, or am more open to other options than I used to be, perhaps might be a better way to say it, is how we use the military and our military involvement. And so I would suggest that we ought to downsize NATO and the U.S. military footprint around the world in general. NATO now seems to me represents the traditional way government functions, in that you establish a program and the program takes on a life of its own, so that it continues long beyond when the program has accomplished what it was supposed to, or as in the case of most programs, long beyond when it's demonstrated it's not going to be able to address what it's supposed to. But in the case of NATO, we have a program that accomplished what it was supposed to, but the program carried on. So with NATO, the objective was to provide a counterbalance in Western Europe to Russia and the broader Soviet Union, as it was known at the time. With the fall of the Soviet Union, following the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, that NATO should have been quietly dissolved and the concerns redirected with respect to how do we relate now to Russia and the former Soviet Union. That issue I address in a couple of other places, so I won't go fully into it now. Suffice it to say, for now, that while at first I thought President Trump was wrong about NATO, and now I think, in fact, that he was right. And had we pursued his attitude and the attitude expressed by Dr. Mearsheimer, John Mearsheimer, and his view on international affairs, I think we would be in a very different place today than we are with respect to Ukraine and just the whole atmosphere on the international stage, the world order. So I think we ought to downsize NATO and the U.S. military footprint around the world, recognize that that would have been easier 2 years ago and probably much easier 40 years ago than it is to see that happening today. But it's definitely something I think we need to take a look at and consider if, in fact, our historic actions um, could have been, um, things could have been handled differently in the past to provide a better present. And if, in fact, we ought to rethink how we're doing things in the present to set the stage for a better future. And that includes leading with constructive international dialogue focused on peace and mutual development, rather than the first foot forward that we seem to have taken over the last several decades of leading with the military and then expecting everybody to love us when the military finishes its job and try to put things back together. And finally, reform the VA. From time to time, criticisms of the VA and its efficiencies or inefficiencies are levied, but never hear of anything actually constructive being accomplished with respect to how the VA functions in delivering and providing medical care to our veterans and addressing the issues that the VA is supposed to address.